G'day ladies and gents, and welcome back to MagzTV. And yes, I know today's video is supposed to be armor on my new schedule. Apologies for that. Unfortunately, school stuff popped up, so I've got to do that first. So that's actually taking me out for about the last 2 days. But I will be getting the next armor video up either tomorrow or on Saturday. So I'll fit it in there. Don't you guys worry about that. Anyways, today I'd actually like to have a little bit of a chat to you about IL-2, because a couple of things have popped up. The first was actually posted on Monday. It was a little bit of a leak on the Russian IL-2 forums. Now, apparently, this hasn't been 100% confirmed yet, but it does look legitimate. Apparently, last Saturday, at a meeting between the developers of IL-2 and Virpil Controls, it was accidentally announced that the next 3 collector's planes for IL-2 will be the Yak-9, the Yak-9T, and a variant of the Hurricane. Currently, that variant is unknown, and there are that many variants of the Hurricane. It could be anything from an anti-tank version, the 20mm cannon versions, or it could just be full of rifle caliber machine guns. We don't actually know, but they seem to be the 3 next collector planes for the series. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, I'm not particularly excited about the introduction of the new Yaks. The Yaks are a fantastic aircraft. The 9 and the 9T are excellent, but we already have 3 variants of the Yak in game. This is just 2 more on top of that. So that's not really blowing my skirt up, although I'm probably going to get them at some point anyway. But the Hurricane, I love the Hurricane. It really was an old workhorse, so it's fantastic to hear that it currently unconfirmed, but it seems to be highly probable that it will be coming into the game very, very soon. Although this did get me thinking on something else that I'd been running through my head for quite some time. And so that's primarily what we're going to have a chat about today. Where does IL-2 go next? As it's currently been mentioned, there is no mention of the next expansion pack for IL-2. We do not know what is coming up after Baseplate. And Baseplate with its aircraft lineup is an incredibly difficult act to follow. Virtually all the mainlined aircraft for the end of World War II in the European theatre are included in this pack. There's a couple here that we're missing. Obviously, we do not have any heavy bombers, because at this point the developers do not do heavy bombers in this version of IL-2. It sucks, I know, I want a B-17 as much as everybody else, but we're not getting one of those just yet, and I don't expect that's going to change anytime soon. But this expansion brought us the Tempest, the P-51, the P-38, the P-47, all in their final forms for World War II in the European theatre, along with pretty much all of the end production fighters, in the form of the K4, the later G models, the D9, and of course the Messerschmitt 262. We kind of had a headline aircraft for another expansion at this end of the war in Europe. So I don't actually think there's going to be one. I mean, let's be clear here. Yes, there were other aircraft that were major drawcards that could be added in on a potential, say, Battle of Berlin expansion. However, if you look at what they are, things like the TA-152, the Arrow, the Salamander, these are aircraft that people would most certainly want to fly. These things are famous. They were also prototypes that never went into full-scale production and never had any major influence on any major battles, including the Battle of Berlin, at all during their end of the war. I mean, the Salamanders only allegedly got into combat once, and that's it. These aircraft are venturing very close into IL-2 1946. What if the war was to run on 1 more year territory? Now, I'm not against that, and I do fully expect that at some point Great Battles will go there. They will do a 1946 expansion, and we will get things like the Horton 229, we will get things like the Salamander, we will get all of the super props from the end of Germany's development. But I don't think they're going to go there just yet. And to be clear, on that expansion we'll probably get things like the Meteor and the P-80 as well, since the P-80s were deployed, although they didn't see any action in the last week of World War II in the European theatre, and the Meteors were obviously flying, but they never crossed the English Channel. But I don't think we're going to go into that expansion pack just yet. At this point, I definitely think we're going to see another expansion in the European theatre before we get to take the ride over to the Pacific. I think they need the devs will need a little bit more time to work on their ships and their development of naval vessels and how they're going to actually operate a Pacific campaign. And there is actually a couple of potential options for expansions that would meet the criteria requirements for that. Now, a couple things that I am going to knock out straight away. Battle of Brittain isn't going to happen. IL-2 Cliffs of Dover is a thing, and North Africa is sort of attached to Cliffs of Dover as well. So while I would love to see a Great Battles version of both of these are likely not going to ever be a thing. Or at least not for some time yet. So, taking those two out of the equation, where else do you go? Well, there is two in particular that I can think of. One I don't think I've ever seen a simulation cover, and one that would be ideal for everything that the developers over at Great Battles are working on at the moment if they need more time before getting into the Pacific. So first, the one that nobody's covered before. The Blitz itself into France. Now, I admit this one is a little bit of a long shot, but just bear with me a little bit here. The Blitz period into France, up to, say, Dunkirk and the start of the Battle of Britain, incorporates most of the early aircraft that took place in the Battle of Britain without actually needing to encroach on Cliffs of Dover. In fact, it would almost work with it. The German Air Force would consist primarily of early 109 models. We are talking pre-E7, so E2s and potentially even late B models. DO-17s, early variants of the Ju-87, and of course for the heavy fighters you'd have the early variants of the Bf-110, most likely the D0 or D1s, as I think they were the ones that took part in France and into the early Battle of Britain. Now for the Allies you'd have access to, of course, British Hurricanes. Beaufort's Beaufighters were deployed into France, I believe, before the fall of Dunkirk, and of course at least a small group of Spitfires, early models Mark 1s, that would be present as well. But of course the Battle of France would also allow for the French to actually get a couple of aircraft into IL-2 as well, as the last standing members of their air force fighting off the Germans as the Germans were rushing in. And of course, being the Blitz, for tank crew, there is a whole new series of tanks that would not be crossed over with the current version of tank crew that could be incorporated. Your early Panzer 38Ts, for example, with period French and British tanks forming the Allied forces, as Britain did have some tanks of their own deployed in France. Not that it really made much of a difference at the time, but they were there nonetheless. So this creates an interesting campaign environment where you would be a retreating force trying to hold back the Germans as they were pushing in. Creates an interesting map to fight over from a multiplayer standpoint. France before the war came to it, or as the war was just coming to it, potentially with parts of Paris on the map, and an entirely new and interesting mix of aircraft that we haven't currently got and are unlikely to see in any other way. This is really the only window in which French aircraft could potentially be incorporated into IL-2. Now, I do admit this one is a long shot, but I think it is nonetheless a really interesting period to take a look at. At the very least, it's as interesting as the Battle of Moscow. In fact, I think the Blitz would be a little bit more so. And it does incorporate some water on the map in the form of the English Channel as what is essentially the backstop to France, and where eventually all things will come to an end in regards to that invasion, which opens up still some space to continue working on naval vessels, if they haven't already done enough in Caban and in Baseplate to, get the Pacific up and running at some point in the future. Remember, we are assuming that the Pacific is not going to be next, and if it was going to be next, I expect they'd be jumping off the walls about it, so I don't hold much hope. The second, and one that I consider to be far more likely, however, is the Battle of Sicily. Now, this takes place primarily against the Italians rather than the Germans, although the Germans were most certainly present. This, however, does solve part of the problem about there being too many German aircraft in the expansion packs as it currently is due to other campaigns, because you would build the core of the aircraft for the expansion out of the Italian planes. I mean, we already have the MC-202 in-game as a collector's plane, so you would get things like the MC-205, the RE-2002 and 2005. You'd also have an opportunity here to bring in things like the DO-217, which is a German aircraft that is extremely well known, but up until this point, hasn't really had a place inside of IL-2. Well, it would serve as the medium bomber. For a heavy fighter, you could also probably bring in the German Me-410. That was operating during this period, and, well, it's a fantastic plane. It would serve perfectly as a heavy fighter for the Axis side. So putting together a series of Axis planes here that are both interesting and unique from what we currently have is actually sort of relatively easy. It also gets around the problem that the Allies have with baseplate, with all of the sort of key end-war Allied fighters all having a place in one expansion all at the same time. Without going into variants, this fact does cause a very similar problem to what the Germans have when trying to add in additional campaigns in that time period. I mean, you've already got the P-51, so how many variants of the P-51 do you want? Well, there are ways to get around it and get some interesting versions. For example, most of the squadrons that operated during the invasion of Sicily had come up from North Africa, and not all of them had been upgraded to the latest version of their fighters at that time, even if that fighter was available. So for example, a lot of the P-51 squadrons that were operating in and around the Mediterranean during the invasion of Sicily were actually flying older Razorback P-51C models. Now, there are significant differences between it and the D model, as most of you know, so that is an interesting variant to actually have included into the game. In addition to that, you've also got the British aircraft and the Australian squadrons. Now, the British obviously had early Mark V Spitfires, they had late model Hurricanes that were in operation, there were also Typhoons that were involved in operating in that particular area. The British were also operating the Beaufighters. Well, there's a heavy fighter option if you don't want to take the Mosquito as a heavy fighter, which was also operating. You have the Beauforts as a bomber option, but the RAAF was also flying British Wellingtons, so there's another medium bomber option. Sicily offers more than enough planes to put together two interesting and unique sides and a whole series of collector planes associated around them, with room potentially for a second expansion in that sort of Mediterranean setting, starting off with Sicily and moving into the invasion of southern Italy. Being Mediterranean based, it also offers the developers more water to play with in order to work on naval units for the potential changeover to a Pacific campaign, and in addition to that, Sicily itself is an island. It is isolated, it has limited borders, and we have tank crew, and there was a massive ground invasion during the invasion of Sicily. So you have a map that has its own natural borders and limitations for ground combat, that also included some pretty serious ground combat and opens up the door for unique aircraft additions for both sides, and probably has enough wiggle room for two expansions comfortably in just this particular area of the Mediterranean. I honestly think this is probably where they're going to go next. I don't know for sure, but just from a logical standpoint, this is probably where I think we're going to go. That being said, I can't think of everything, so I want to toss this out to you guys. Let me know in the comment section down below, where do you think the next IL-2, before it's announced, is going to actually go? Where are we going to see the next expansion play out? What aircraft do you think will be involved? And why do you come to this conclusion? Let's make a little bit of noise here and see whether or not we can get the attention of the devs, and hopefully, maybe, actually trigger an announcement to where we're going next so we can find out for sure. Anyways, ladies and gents, I hope you enjoyed this little thought experiment. Thank you very much for watching. As always, check the video description below for links to my everything, and until next time, remember to click that like button if you did, share and subscribe if you'd like to see more, and as always, take care.